But this morning in part number 3, we're going to talk about the types of ministry leaders from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 8 through 13. You might want to look along in your Bible. I'll be putting the NIV translation on the screen, and let's look at it together. Beginning at verse number 8. In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must first be tested, and then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. In the same way, the women, verse number 11, in the same way the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. A deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and household well. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. This is God's Word. Now, we're going to unpack these verses this morning, and as we do, we'll take step by step along the way. In the first place, I want to ask the question, who are these individuals that Paul is referring to? In the original Greek text, the word here is the diakonoi. Likewise, the diakonoi must be. Who are these individuals that, beginning here in verse number 8, that Paul refers to as the diakonoi? Well, let's do some definitions. In the first place, the Greek word diakonoi is the plural word for the Greek word diakonos. Diakonos is the singular, diakonoi is the plural, and the word only means this: someone who serves. Someone who serves as an intermediary in a transaction, an agent, an intermediary, a courier, one who gets something done at the behest of a superior or assistant. So the diakonoi are some individuals that are servants that are serving at the direction of someone else. It is clearly implied the individuals that they're serving in direction from are the elders that are mentioned in verses 1 through 7. So again, the word just simply means one who performs a service. Now, in most English translations, many of them in fact, as well as the NIV that we read from just a moment ago, translate the Greek word diakonoi with the English transliteration deacons. Now, what does the word deacon mean? Well, actually, the word deacon is an invented word. It is an invented English word that is not even really, it was a word that came over from the Greek. You can hear it. Diakonoi or diakonos is the Greek word. It just means a servant. But when English translators translated the Greek New Testament, many of them would invent an English word that is not a translation. The translation is servant, but a transliteration, which is an invented word, deacon. Now, the problem with the English word deacon is that for many of us coming from a religious background of 2,000 years of church history, the Greek word, the English transliterated word deacon carries with it some idea of a governing authority. But it is important to see that the original Greek word did not have that connotation at all. Not this governing authority. It just simply means a servant. That's all it means. Now, in the New Testament, the Greek word diakonoi, or the singular diakonos, is used throughout the New Testament to refer to a variety of people. In other words, 1 Timothy 3, verse number 8 is not the first time the New Testament has used this word. The word is used throughout the New Testament to describe a variety of different people doing a variety of different things. Let me give you some examples. In Matthew chapter 20 and verse 26, Jesus uses this same word to refer to what all Christians should be. Every Christian should be a servant. Every Christian should be a diakonos. Every single one of us. However, the word is used in a more specific sense, referring some specific tasks that individual Christians were given. For example, the Apostle Paul, who was an apostle, refers to himself as a diakonoi or a diakonos in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 7 and Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23. Paul would refer to some co-laborers that ministered with him in the preaching of the gospel and referred to them as diakonos, such as Tychicus in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 21 and Epaphras in Colossians chapter 1 and verse number 7. And then in Romans chapter 16 and verse 1, Paul writes to the Roman church and says, I want you to receive Phoebe, a feminine name of a woman. He says, I want you to receive her, who is a diakonos in the church in Cenchrea. Paul says that Phoebe is a servant from a specific congregation representing a specific congregation, and she most likely was the courier of the Roman letter. She was the one that actually was responsible with taking this letter from Paul's pen to the church at Rome. So in the first place, what I want us to get from this idea of what are or who are the diakonoi, the main point is this, and I can't stress it strongly enough. It's about service. It's not about authority. It's about service. Now, in the specific text that we're examining this morning in 1 Timothy chapter 3, we see at least two different types of diakonoi that are mentioned, or servants that are mentioned. In the first place, we see the first type beginning in verse number 8 and going through verse number 10 and then picking up again in verses 12 and verse 13. We'll get to verse number 11 in just a moment. But in the first type, we see that Paul first describes the servants. And notice the way he introduces it. He says, in the same way or likewise. In other words, he's discussed in the previous verses the character traits that should be present in someone who is serving as an overseer or an elder in the church. In other words, here is a recognized role, and that role is defined as being one of governing authority, one of direction of the affairs of the church. But he says, in the same way, here is another recognized role, and nowhere in the description is it one of governing authority. Rather, it is just simply the servants. He says, here's the characteristics that should be present in the life of an individual who will be recognized in some capacity in coordinating some service in the ministry of the church. So he's first describing these servants. And notice in the first place, this role is distinct from the elders. It is a distinctive, different role. Whereas the role of the elders that we see in the first 7 verses is one of exercising authority in the church. In fact, I would cite for you passages like, if you look here in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 3, there's an indication that that is the role of the elders, that they must have this responsibility for attending to the affairs of or caring for God's church, verse number 5. And then in chapter 5 and verse number 17 of this same letter, he says that an elder who directs the affairs of the church. And so there again we have this idea of the elders having a responsibility that involves exercising a governing authority. And additionally, the elders must be able to teach. We see that in chapter 3 and verse 2. And then also any elder that is laboring well in both preaching and teaching, in addition to the governing authority, chapter 5 and verse number 17, is worthy of double honor. And then in Titus chapter 1 and verse 9, again, the elders having this responsibility for teaching. Here's the point. The elders have a distinct role that involves exercising authority and teaching. But nowhere in the description of the servants, the diakonoi, neither one of those is said of them. In other words, this is a distinctive and different role. It is not a governing board. The diakonoi are not a governing board like the elders are. It is a different role entirely that simply involves the area of recognized service. It is a role distinct from the elders. But it is a role that involves some recognized leadership. Otherwise, you say, well, every Christian should be a servant. Every Christian should be a diakonos, right? Jesus said that. But here in this passage, he's recognizing, okay, here is our particular servants of all the Christians that are doing their service. Here are particular Christians that are serving that you need to recognize. You say, what is the point of recognizing them? Because they're exercising some degree of direction, some degree of leadership, not administrative leadership like the elders, but instead or not governing leadership, but instead it is administrative leadership. That is, they are working under the coordination, under the direction of the elders for the purpose of coordinating ministries. So again, the role is distinct from the elders, but it is one that is of a recognized role of coordinating or directing services of ministry in the local church. Now, who is it that should be appointed or recognized in these roles as servants that are coordinating ministry in the local church? Paul is pretty clear that it shouldn't be just anybody. The role requires a certain level of spiritual maturity. And hence we have the character traits that he describes here. And if you look at all of those traits in these verses, it basically kind of comes down to this. That if you're going to officially as a church recognize people that are doing service, that seem to especially be gifted in that service, that can help mobilize others and get others involved in the ministry too, they should have certain character traits that demonstrate they are people of integrity, they are people that are trustworthy, and they are people that are committed to the cause and the mission of Christ. Now, when you look at the particular traits, which we see here in verses 8, 9, and 10, you get that idea. But then skipping down to verses 12 and 13, he goes on to describe further traits that the servant should possess. And the wording here, hear me closely on this, the wording here, which says, essentially, the deacon or the diakonoi, the diakonos, the servant, must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and household well. That wording, and most scholars I consulted this week agreed with this, the wording here does not make certain that this verse is requiring someone who occupies this role to be married or to have children. But rather, what it is saying is, if they are married, they should be faithful to their wife. If they do have children, they should be able to manage their children and household well. So the point is this. The point is they need to be trustworthy, they need to have integrity, and they need to have a commitment to the cause of Christ. This is the first type of ministry leaders that are described. But there's a second type, and it's found in verse number 11. Paul uses this language when he says, likewise, notice that in verse number, same terminology. He's talked about the elders in verses 1 through 7. Then he says in verse 8, in the same way, or likewise, the diakonoi. And then in verse number 11, in the same way, likewise, the gunei. That's what the Greek says. Likewise, the gunei, which means women. Now, the Greek word gunei is a singular. You see the plural term there on the screen as well. The word simply means an adult female person or a woman, a married woman or wife, a newly married woman or bride. Now, depending upon the context in which the word is used, will determine whether what is specifically in view is women generally or more specifically the wife of someone. Now, when it comes to biblical interpretation for verse number 11, there are two possible views that could be in mind here. Paul could legitimately, in this context, have in mind the wives of those that are serving as the diakonoi, the wives of those that are serving as servants, recognized ministry leaders in the local church. That is very possible. In fact, various English translations of the Bible translate it that way. But it is equally possible that what Paul may have in mind is another category. In other words, you've got male diakonoi, and you also have female diakonoi. So either one is possible. Let's look at some English translations. The King James Version goes this direction and says, "Even so must their wives be." Clearly, you can see the way the King James translators rendered this word, they're referring to the wives of those that would serve as the diakonoi, or the servants. The English Standard Version and the New Living Translation that I generally preach from follow this same interpretation and render it their wives. But here's something important to note. In the original Greek, there is no possessive pronoun. The word the English word there is not represented in the original Greek text. It's not present. Now, in the New International Version, the 2011 edition of it, they go this direction. They say, "In the same way, the women are to be." And so they leave it more general. But again, this is problematic because the definite article in the English, the word "the," not present in the Greek text. And so when you say "the women," you say, okay, what women are you referring to? In the New American Standard Version, they go in this direction and they say, "Women must likewise be." And actually, this is the better translation from the original Greek text. But the problem is, when you leave it general like that and say women, why would Paul do that? Why would Paul say, okay, here's what the overseers what they should be like. Likewise, here's what the servants, the diakonoi, should be like. And then out of the blue, oh, by the way, women, like women just generally, like any woman, all women, why would you refer to it that in such a general way? Paul is clearly talking not about just all women generally, but he's talking about some specific women. And so the question is, what specific women is he referring to? Now, I know I'm getting down in the weeds here, but I know this is the area that we'll get the most questions on, so I'm spending a little time on it. Notice here the Greek-English interlinear. You'll see at the top the Greek words that are present in the original text. Underneath it, you see the English lettering for those Greek words. And then you see the part of speech of every particular word. And then the translation underneath that. So notice in the first place that the first word here is the word gune in the plural form. In other words, this is the word that can, depending on the context, can mean women or wives. And it's not woman or wife, but it's plural. It either here means women or wives. It's in the accusative, which means this is the subject of the sentence, and it's feminine, and then it's plural. So it could mean either women or wives, but again, notice there is no definite article. The Greeks had a definite article, our English "the," not present, so it's not "the women." And also, there is no qualifier. There's not a correlated word to the English word "their." It doesn't read "their wives" or "their women." It just says, "likewise, women." That's what the Greek text says. So again, the question is, who's he talking about? I'm convinced there are good reasons to see this as a separate category of women diakonoi. I think there are good reasons for it. Let me give you some of those reasons. In the first place, Paul uses the same introductory word that he used when he introduced the diakonoi earlier in verse number 8. When he said, all right, here, the elders who have their governing authority over the local church, they should have this certain character traits. Then he says, oh, and likewise, new category, the diakonoi must be. And then we get to verse 11, and he uses the same pattern and says, likewise, the gune. likewise women. So he's introducing, I think there's good reason the way that he uses that introductory word to say this is introducing a new category. Secondly, the position of verse number 11 in the flow of thought can naturally be taken to mean that women serve in this same role just as men do. Thirdly, there is no corresponding list of traits for overseers' wives. If, in fact, this is the wives of the deacons, why no list for the wives of the elders? It doesn't really make sense, because we would expect that is that's a role of tremendous responsibility. Elders who are overseeing the work of the church. And if somehow the servants should have wives of a certain character, wouldn't you expect Paul to say the overseers should have wives of a certain character? And yet it is missing entirely, which to me gives evidence that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about women that are serving as diakonoi, or servants, just like men would. And then next, if this is referring to the wives of the servants, we would expect there to be a qualifier. We would expect Paul to say their wives, which many English translations render it that way, but Paul doesn't say it in the original Greek. And by the way, there was a Greek word for that, autos, which means there, and that word is not in the original Greek text. And then fifthly, we have an example. We have an example in the Bible of a woman called a diakonos of a specific church. This is Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes, by the way, the same Paul who wrote this, wrote Romans 16, 1 and 2, and seemingly Paul had no qualms or no reservations or no nervousness about saying this of this woman using the exact same language he uses in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 11. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a diakonos in the original Greek text. In fact, the NIV and other translations render it that way, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. Now, you will notice from whatever English translation you're reading from, you probably have a footnote there that will say this is either just means a servant or it means a female deacon or deaconess. Many would say, well, no, Paul is not referring to her being recognized as a ministry leader here. He's just using diakonos in the general sense of just calling her a servant. To which I might agree, except it be for the fact that Paul goes one step further. He doesn't just say, I commend to you the servant Phoebe. He goes one step further, in fact, 2 steps further. On the one hand, he says, I commend to you Phoebe, who is a diakonos, and then he says this, of the church in Cenchrea. In other words, Paul is identifying Phoebe as a particular servant who is representing a specific congregation. And then he goes one step further and says she has been a benefactor of many people, including me, in verse number 2. The Greek word here that is translated benefactor means a patron. In fact, one particular Greek lexicon that I consulted defined that Greek word as a leader or director. Way of coordinating some type of ministry, and perhaps what Paul has in mind is the fact that she was the one that was the courier who is taking this letter to the Roman church. And so she had been entrusted by Paul to do that task. You say, that's an important role. This church was going to be dependent upon this letter that Paul is writing to them. And Paul chooses her specifically and tasks her with this ministry work. Take this letter to the church at Rome. And then he writes to the church in Rome and says, you receive her and you respect her in the role that she has to play because I have sent her on this mission. And then finally, number 6, the idea of a woman serving or working as a recognized ministry leader or servant over a ministry in a local church does not contradict 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 12. 1 Timothy chapter 2, it's the same letter back in the previous chapter, Paul says this. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Now, the reason why a woman being recognized as a diakonos in a local church does not contradict that verse is because the role itself does not involve teaching or exercising authority over men. It doesn't involve that. It is simply serving. That's all it is. And by the way, there's a long history of female ministry leaders present in the church. This is not anything new. If for some reason you think this is something brand new or this is some kind of modernistic agenda, let me bring you up to speed a little bit on it. Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, wrote to the Emperor Trajan about Christians on the very cusp of the first century in AD 112. And he said this to the emperor in reporting about the Christians. He says, I have placed 2 women called deaconesses under torture. This is 112 AD, and already a pagan governor is recognizing among the Christians that there are women serving in these roles as diakonoi. Also, in the 3rd century, the Didaskalia, which is the teaching of the 12, it's a book that gives us some indication of what the church did as far as their practices in the 3rd century. It says this is 3rd century AD. And when she who is being baptized has come up from the water, let the deaconess receive her. Thou also hast need of the ministry of deaconess for many things. And this, if you go on and read, and I can give you the citation of this, and go back and read it yourself. But in this, it says that in the 3rd century, you had, when women were baptized, that you had female recognized ministry leaders that were assisting them in those baptisms. And not only that, but there were many other works of ministry, such as visitation in homes to the sick, that these women were being sent as ambassadors on behalf of the church to do that ministry. He goes on to say that. And then let's look at our own fellowship. Alexander Campbell. Anybody recognize that name? Alexander Campbell, among our fellowship, when he translated the New Testament in what he calls the Living Oracles in 1826, here's how he translates Romans 16:1. I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a deaconess in the congregation at Cenchrea. This is 1826, Alexander Campbell. He goes on to say in his Millennial Harbinger in 1835, he says this, from Romans 16:1, as well as 1 Timothy 3:11, it appears that females were constituted deaconesses in the primitive church. Duties to females as well as to males demand this. In other words, Campbell is saying that there are so many ministries that are needed in the local church that it demands that we need people leading ministries that are not just men, but women too. It demands that we need that. B.W. Johnson, I don't know how many of you have in your home a copy of the People's New Testament, but B.W. Johnson was someone in our fellowship in 1891 who basically wrote a study Bible for the New Testament. I have a copy in my office. And on Romans 16:1, in that study Bible, B.W. Johnson says this, but we know that there were deaconesses in the church of the 1st century. And Paul, in giving her a recommendation, no doubt mentions her office. G.W. Brewer, in his book, The Model Church, which was originally published in 1919, later republished by the Gospel Advocate. You can go back and look in that, and he says, G.C. Brewer says, there is nothing in the work that belongs to deacons that a woman cannot consistently with the inhibitions laid upon her by the Scriptures. In other words, what Brewer is saying is, there is nothing in the work of being a servant, or if you want to use the old term deacon, which is a transliteration, I think that's a misleading term. But if you look at a ministry leader or you look at a servant in the local church, there's nothing that the servant would do that would violate the restrictions that Paul places upon women to not teach or exercise authority over men. There's nothing in that work that would contradict that. C.R. Nichol, in his book God's Woman in 1938 said this: evidently, that was the view of the translators of the King James Version. What view is he talking about? The view that 1 Timothy 3:11 is talking about the wives of the ministry leaders or servants. He says evidently that was the view of the King James translators, but he goes on to say this: in truth, verse number 11, 1 Timothy 3, in this passage does not have reference to the wife of a deacon. In other words, Brewer is saying it's referring to female ministry leaders. Now, here's where we all come down to. I was reading in one particular commentary, and the commentator made this observation. He says, really, if you stop and think about it, whether you view 1 Timothy 3:11 as being the wives of the servants, or you view it as being female servants, at the end of the day, you end up at the same place. And the same place is this: either view agrees that we need quality women in the local church that are involved in the work of the diakonos. We need them. In fact, Paul gives character traits that must be present. However you view it, they need to have a certain quality and need to be involved in this work. Now again, not only is this not anything new in church history or in our fellowship, if you have just now come to Northside, and Jim mentioned this earlier, you need to know this is nothing new for Northside. Leslie Chapman preached on this regularly. Phil mentioned this in some sermons as well. Northside for over 10 years has utilized women in official roles of ministry leadership. We had women like Jennifer Comer, who led ministry. Faith Sessler has led ministry. Deb Flowers is currently leading ministry. This is nothing new for Northside at all. We have practiced this at Northside for years and years and years. In fact, I would argue that whether it is officially talked about or not, every church I've ever worked with has had women serving in these roles. We may not have talked about it, but functionally it has been being done. Every single church does this. In fact, if I'm being quite honest, let's think about it now. And I'll just call it like I see it and be totally objective. Every church I have ever been a part of or worked with or been a member of, if you just look across the work of the church, probably 85% of every ministry done by the church is being done by women. Now, I don't say that to proudly, because that's a real dig on us men. Us men need to step up. But I am saying to you that we have women that have been actively involved in coordinating ministries, putting together ministries, and it has been practiced. We just have not really maybe talked about it. And the reason I wanted to talk about it today is to tell you that we're moving forward in ministry here at Northside, and we want to build ministry as strong as it's ever been here. And in order to do that, we want to say, hey, we want to do it God's way. And if we're going to do it God's way, we're willing to go back and look at Scripture and say, what does God say about it? And let's do it the way God said to do it. And so that's our contention, and that's what we're trying to do. Now, I need to stop right there. There's so much more I could say, and there may be some questions that you yet still have about this topic. And if that is the case, this morning, I've been working all week, and I've shared this with the shepherds, and they've given me some ideas that I've incorporated into it as well. But I have written a long document that gives a biblical rationale for what I've talked about this morning. And that document, with all of the footnotes and links to all of these quotes I've shared with you, most of them are online. You can click it and go right to the link. That is available for you this morning in the lobby. You can pick up a copy on your way out, and also it's available on the Northside Nashville app this morning for you to read. Now, I couldn't put the footnotes on the app. I couldn't figure out how to do it. But the article there is there, and if you want the footnotes, pick up a paper copy in the lobby this morning. And in addition, as Jim mentioned, next week after part number 4, for anybody that would like to remain in the auditorium rather than go to life groups, we invite you to stay in the auditorium. We're happy to have a question and answer session session with anybody that has any questions, or if you'd like to have a private interaction with either myself or the shepherds, we want to be an open book, and we're happy to talk with you at more length about it. But here's where I want us to end up. We're moving forward with ministry at Northside. We're going to do great things moving forward, and we need everybody all in. And we need ministry leadership. Now, rather than using the transliterated term deacon, we've chosen to use a different descriptor that we think is wholly biblical. What did these diakonoi do? They coordinated or led ministry efforts. So we just simply call them ministry leaders. This is not another layer of coordination. It is simply the role we described right here in this text. And they will coordinate ministry underneath the direction of the elders. And we're praying that God will raise people up, both men and women, who fit the bill of the character traits that are described here. People of integrity and trustworthiness, committed to the mission of Christ and the mission of Northside, and that have the Holy Spirit filling them to lead us in ministry efforts moving forward. Now, next week, we're going to get real practical in the part 4 of this series. And we're going to talk about the specific ministries that Northside is involved in. We're going to talk about the ministry directory that we're going to make available to you that talk about the special areas of ministry that we're focusing in on. And we're going to give special interest next week to the areas of ministry that need leadership, ministry leadership. And we're going to outline a process for you as a church nominating individuals to lead in those particular ministries. So you can look forward to that next week. Again, what is a ministry leader? It is simply somebody who coordinates ministry efforts of service underneath the direction of the elders. And so I ask you to continue to pray that God is going to raise up those leaders.